Welcome to Stuff Works Explained. If you're here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. In this video, we'll be talking about the Project Oil Kenya, where we try to understand Turkana Oil, the story of Kenya's biggest petroleum dream. When oil was discovered in Turkana in 2012, Kenya appeared to be standing at the threshold of a historic economic transformation. For decades, the country had imported virtually all of its petroleum requirements, and even now it continues to do that. And this exposes the country to volatile global oil prices, as well as draining billions of shillings in terms of forex. Suddenly, the possibility emerged that Kenya could join the ranks of oil-producing countries. The announcement triggered excitement, rarely seen in the country's economic history. Politicians spoke of a future of prosperity. Investors rushed to assess opportunities. Communities in Turkana hoped for jobs, infrastructure, and social services. For many Kenyans, the discovery was viewed as a turning point that would accelerate industrialization, reduce dependence on imports, among other things. More than a decade later, however, Kenya is yet to produce the first commercial barrel of oil. What happened between discovery and today? Why has Project Oil Kenya taken so long? What role did Tullow Oil, Total Energies, and African Oil play? Why did some partners leave? What does the arrival of Gulf Energy mean? Then, and perhaps the most important question is Kenya still likely to become an oil-producing country? This is the story of Turkana Oil, its promise, its challenges, and reality that has shaped one of the most ambitious projects in Kenya's history. Let's start by unpacking the discovery that changed the conversation. Commercial oil was discovered in March 2012 at Ngamia 1 well in South Lokichar Basin in Turkana County. The discovery was made by Tullow Oil, the then Africa's most successful independent exploration company, together with its partners. Although oil exploration in Kenya dates back several decades, earlier efforts had yielded little success. Ngamia discovery was different. It was quickly followed by additional discoveries in the fields such as Twiga and Amosing, confirming that South Lokichar Basin contained significant petroleum resources. The basin is located in northwestern Kenya, part of the East African Rift Valley system. Geologically, the area shares characteristics with petroleum-producing regions elsewhere in the world, particularly Rift Basin, where organic material accumulated over millions of years and was transformed into hydrocarbons. As appraisal drilling continued, estimates of discovered oil resources increased substantially. The project eventually reported hundreds of millions of barrels of recoverable resources, placing Kenya among Africa's most significant recent onshore discovery. Why the discovery generated so much excitement? The timing was important. East Africa was emerging as a major hydrocarbon frontier. Uganda had discovered large oil reserves around Lake Albert, while significant gas discoveries have been made offshore of Tanzania and Mozambique. Kenya appeared poised to join the regional energy revolution. At the time, projections suggested that oil exports could generate substantial government revenue, improve the balance of payments, attract foreign investment, and stimulate infrastructure development. Turkana itself, one of the Kenya's historically marginalized regions, was expected to benefit through roads, jobs, local procurement opportunities, as well as community investment. Yet, a discovery is only the beginning of an oil project's life cycle. Let's try to unpack the journey from discovery to production. Many people assume that discovering oil automatically leads to production. In reality, discovery is only one stage in the long and expensive process. The first phase is exploration, where companies search for oil using geological studies, seismic surveys, as well as exploratory drilling. The second phase is appraisal, during which additional wells are drilled to determine the size, quality, and the extent of the resource. The third phase involves feasibility and commercial assessment. Engineers, economists, among others, evaluate whether oil can be produced profitably under expected market conditions. This is followed by development planning, which includes designing production facilities, export systems, and environmental safeguards, as well as financing arrangements. Only after these stages are completed does commercial production begin. For Kenya, the greatest delay occurred after discovery and during transition from appraisal to development. Let's now look at the commercial viability question. A major milestone was the submission of the Field Development Plan (FDP). This is the blueprint explaining how oil will be produced and transported to the market. Studies concluded that the South Lokichar resource were technically producible and commercially viable within certain assumptions. However, commercial viability relied heavily on global oil prices, project costs, as well as export infrastructure. Unlike oil-producing countries with established pipelines and terminals, Kenya had to build much of the required infrastructure from scratch. The most important requirement was a crude oil pipeline, export pipeline for this matter, linking Turkana to the coast. Without a reliable evacuation route, large-scale production would not be feasible. Which are the companies behind Project Oil Kenya? Let's unpack that. Tullow Oil became the dominant operator of the project. The company had built a reputation for making frontier discoveries across Africa, particularly in Ghana. Over time, Tullow Oil was joined by partners including Total Energies and Africa Oil. Each company brought different strengths. Tullow provided operational leadership and exploration expertise. Total Energies brought technical capability, financial strength, and experience in developing large-scale oil projects. Africa Oil contributed capital and maintained strategic interest in East Africa petroleum development. Initially, the partnership was seen as a strong combination capable of advancing Kenya toward production. Then, why progress slowed? Several factors combined to slow development. First was the issue of infrastructure. Building a pipeline from Turkana to the coast would require billions of dollars in investment. Second was the collapse of the global oil prices beginning in 2014. Lower prices significantly reduced the attractiveness of the capital-intensive projects worldwide. Third were the regulatory and fiscal negotiations. Governments and investors often spend years negotiating how revenues, taxes, and risks will be shared. Fourth were community concerns. Land access questions and local expectations, where communities expected visible benefits while companies sought predictable operating conditions, and these are conflicting interests. Finally, financing became increasingly difficult. Global investors became more cautious towards oil projects, particularly in the frontier market, given the unfolding climate change concerns. Then came the early oil pilot scheme. To test logistics and demonstrate that Kenya oil could reach international markets, the early oil pilot scheme was launched. With this initiative, crude oil was transported by road from Turkana to the Mombasa port for export. The project was never intended to be a permanent solution. Trucking oil over such long distances was expensive as well as inefficient. Its purpose was to gather operation data, test crude quality, develop local skills, and build confidence among investors and policymakers. The pilot demonstrated that Kenya crude could be produced and exported. It also highlighted the limitations of relying on road transport and reinforced the need for a pipeline. Then the story of exiting of Total Energies and Africa Oil. One of the most significant developments came when Total Energies and Africa Oil decided to exit the project. Their departure reflected a combination of commercial and strategic consideration. For major international oil companies, investment decisions compete with opportunities around the world. Projects with higher expected returns, lower risk, or quicker development timelines often receive priority. The prolonged uncertainty surrounding infrastructure, financing, and timelines reduced the attractiveness of the Project Oil Kenya. Their withdrawal placed greater pressure on Tullow Oil, which suddenly found itself carrying a larger share of responsibility for advancing the project. The exits also affected investor confidence. Potential financiers often view the departure of an experienced partner as a signal that the project risks remain unresolved. Then Tullow Oil difficult position. By the time its partners exited, Tullow Oil found itself facing broader corporate challenges. The company had accumulated debt and was restructuring its portfolio. Across the industry, investors increasingly demanded capital discipline rather than aggressive expansion. Kenya's project required substantial investment, additional for that matter, particularly for the field development as well as export infrastructure. This raised an important question. Did Tullow Oil have the financial capacity to take the project all the way to the first oil? The evidence increasingly suggested that Tullow Oil needed either a powerful strategic partner or a complete exit. And we'll see that Tullow Oil decided to exit. Critics argued that Tullow Oil's history showed a tendency to discover as well as de-risk resources before bringing in larger partners. Supporters countered this is a common model among independent exploration companies, which specialize in finding resources rather than financing multi-billion-dollar developments. Then there was search for new partners. For several years, efforts were made to attract new investors. Potential partners reportedly examined the opportunity, but interest remained constrained by several factors. The project required substantial capital. Global energy companies were reducing exposure to long-term oil developments. Environmental and social governance pressure were increasing. Competition from lower-cost projects elsewhere remained intense. As a result, getting a replacement partner proved difficult. Then came Gulf Energy. The emergence of Gulf Energy marked a new chapter. Known primarily as a Kenya Energy and Infrastructure Company, Gulf Energy agreed to acquire interests associated with the project, creating renewed optimism about moving development forward. The transaction attracted attention because Gulf was not a traditional upstream oil producer of the scale normally associated with large petroleum developments. Supporters argued that local ownership could accelerate decision making and as well as align the project more closely with national priorities. Critics questioned whether Gulf Energy possessed sufficient technical and financial capacity for development requiring billions of dollars in investment. Ultimately, success will depend less on ownership and more on the company's ability to secure financing, attract technical expertise, and maintain regulatory support. Let's look at the economics. What could Kenya realistically gain out of this? Public discussions often focus on oil in the ground. Investors focus on oil that can be produced profitably. Not all discovered oil is recoverable. A portion remains trapped underground or is uneconomic to produce. Current estimates suggest several hundred million barrels of recoverable resources in South Lokichar Basin in Turkana. Peak production scenarios have often centered around approximately 50,000 barrels per day, although actual production rates would depend on final development plans and market conditions. If achieved, production could continue for 2 decades or even more, though output would gradually decline as fields mature. Government revenues would come through taxes, royalties, profit-sharing arrangements, and indirect economic activity. However, revenues would be first offset by recovery of development cost. This is a standard in production sharing system, where investors recover approved expenditures before profits are divided according to agreed formulas. Let's look at the question of pipeline and refinery debate. The original development concept relied heavily on crude oil export pipeline. A domestic refinery has periodically been discussed, but refining is a separate business requiring additional investment, scale, and market demand. For the foreseeable future, exporting crude remains the more realistic pathway, although there have been developments of building a refinery in Mombasa City. The challenge is ensuring that transportation costs do not erode project economics. Whether through a dedicated pipeline or alternative arrangements, moving oil efficiently from Turkana into international markets remains central to the project's success. Let's look at the community expectation and the local content component. No discussion of Turkana oil is complete without considering local communities. Residents expected employment, business opportunities, as well as improved public services. Some benefits have materialized through infrastructure, training, and procurement programs, yet expectations often exceeded what the project could deliver during its pre-production phase. Local content policies seek to ensure that Kenya's businesses as well as workers participate meaningfully in the industry. Managing expectation remains critical. Oil projects create opportunity, but they rarely transform local economies overnight. So, when will Kenya produce its first oil? This is the question that has been there for more than a decade. Several dates have come and gone. The reality is that first oil relies on financing, final investment decisions, as well as infrastructure development and regulatory approvals. The project today is arguably closer to production than it was during the years of uncertainty following partners' exit. Yet, significant work remains before commercial operations start. A realistic assessment suggests that Kenya First commercial oil remains a medium term rather than an immediate prospect, although there has been reports that first commercial oil will be ready this year, 2026. Now, let's make a conclusion where we say that the story of Turkana oil is neither one of failure nor one of guaranteed success. It is the story of a major resource discovery meeting the complex reality of project development. Since the 2012 discovery, Kenya has confirmed substantial oil reserves or resources, completed extensive appraisal work, tested export through the early oil pilot scheme, as well as attracted some of the world's most experienced petroleum companies. Yet, the journey from discovery to production has proven far more difficult than many anticipated. Infrastructure issues, fluctuating oil prices, financing constraints, regulatory negotiations, partner withdrawals, and shifting global energy priorities combined to slow the progress. The exits of Total Energies and African Oil, followed by Tullow Oil efforts to structure its position, marked critical turning points. The arrival of Gulf Energy has opened a new chapter, but it has also raised fresh questions about financing, technical capabilities, as well as execution. The ultimate measure of success will not be how much oil lies beneath Turkana's soil. It will be whether Kenya can develop the resource efficiently, transparently, and sustainably, while ensuring that investors earn reasonable returns, communities receive tangible benefits, and the country secures lasting economic value. That remains the unfinished chapter in the Kenya's oil story. More than a decade after discovery, the dream is still alive. The challenge is now turning potential into production. Thank you for reaching this far. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. You can also watch other videos that you have made on this topic, among others. Thank you, and let's meet in the next one.